Alex Morrison found the book in the back corner of the university library's third floor, wedged between two dusty volumes on medieval philosophy that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. It was a slim paperback with a plain black cover, no title visible on the spine. What caught his attention wasn't the book itself, but its placement. Someone had clearly hidden it there deliberately, pushed back behind the other books, so only the edge was visible. Alex was supposed to be researching his senior thesis on existentialism and free will. Instead, he pulled out the hidden book and examined it. The cover was unmarked except for a single line of text in silver lettering: The Ordinary Life of Alex Morrison. His name, his exact name. Alex looked around the empty third floor. The library was always deserted this late on a Wednesday evening. He opened the book to the first page. No author name, no publisher information. No copyright date, just text that began, Alex Morrison was born on March 14, 1999, in Seattle, Washington, to parents who had met 7 years earlier at a coffee shop on Pike Street. His mother ordered a vanilla latte. His father ordered black coffee and tried to impress her with a quote from Nietzsche that he'd misremembered. She corrected him. They'd been married for 26 years. Alex's hands began to shake. The details were correct, all of them. His birthday, where his parents met, a story his mother loved telling, even the Nietzsche quote incident, which he'd only heard about once, years ago, and had nearly forgotten. He flipped through more pages. The book chronicled his childhood, the time he broke his arm falling off the monkey bars at age 7. His first day of middle school, when he'd worn his shirt inside out and hadn't noticed until lunch. The summer he'd spent at his grandmother's house in Portland, learning to play chess. His first kiss with Emily Chen behind the gym in 10th grade. Every detail was accurate. Every memory documented with perfect precision. This wasn't a novel. It was his biography. But Alex had never authorized any biography, had never told anyone these specific stories in this specific order. He kept reading, unable to stop, even as his rational mind screamed that this was impossible. The book continued through high school, documented his decision to attend Washington State University, described his first semester struggles with chemistry, his pivot to philosophy, his 3 years of increasingly focused study on questions of determinism and choice. The text reached his current year, his current semester, his current week, and then Alex Morrison found the book on a Wednesday evening in November. He was alone on the third floor of the library. It was 8:47 p.m. He had been researching his thesis on free will, which struck him as deeply ironic in retrospect. Alex checked his phone. 8:47 p.m. exactly. His heart was hammering now. He turned the page with trembling fingers. He wondered if he was dreaming. Checked his phone to verify the time. Felt his heart rate accelerating. Turned the page with trembling fingers just like this. The book was describing his actions in real time, as he read them, as he performed them. Alex closed the book abruptly, set it on the desk, stood up, walked 3 steps away. Told himself this was insane, some kind of prank, a trick, but the details were too specific, too accurate. No one knew all of those childhood stories. No one had been there for all of those moments. Unless the book wasn't documenting the past, unless it was documenting all of time simultaneously, past, present, and future woven together in a single narrative where everything had already happened, was happening, and would happen, where Alex's choices weren't choices at all, but predetermined points on a timeline he'd been following his entire life without knowing it. Alex felt dizzy. He sat back down, picked up the book again, read the next sentence. He sat back down, picked up the book again, couldn't help himself. Because if the book could predict his past and present, what did it say about his future? This was impossible. Books didn't work this way. Reality didn't work this way. But the evidence was right in front of him, describing his every move with perfect accuracy. Alex flipped ahead, skimming pages. He saw his name recurring, saw descriptions of scenes he recognized and scenes he didn't. His graduation ceremony next spring, a job interview at a tech company in Seattle, an apartment he'd never seen, a woman named Sarah whom he'd apparently meet at a friend's wedding. The book documented 5 years of his future in detail. And then the chapters began to take on ominous titles. Chapter 47, The First Symptom. Chapter 48, The Diagnosis. Chapter 49, The Treatment That Failed. Chapter 50, The Day He Reads This. Alex stopped, felt ice spreading through his chest. Chapter 50 was the current chapter, the chapter describing this moment, right now, in the library. And the chapter title, The Day He Reads This. Not the day he found the book, not the discovery, but the day he reads this, as though this specific moment, this specific reading, was significant enough to warrant its own chapter title. Alex didn't want to read further. Every instinct told him to close the book, walk away, pretend he'd never found it. But the book had already predicted that impulse. Alex didn't want to read further. Every instinct told him to close the book, walk away, pretend he'd never found it. But he couldn't, because not knowing was worse than knowing. Because the human mind, once presented with a question about its own future, cannot resist seeking the answer. Damn it. The book was right. Alex turned the page and continued reading. A chapter described his current physical state. Elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, the slight tremor in his hands. It described his thoughts with unnerving accuracy. The debate between his rational mind. This is a prank, a trick, an elaborate hoax, and his instinctive fear. But what if it's not? And then the chapter began to describe what would happen next. Alex would read until he reached the revelation in this chapter. He would learn something about himself that he'd been avoiding for months. Something his body already knew, but his conscious mind had been refusing to acknowledge. The headaches that came and went. The brief moment of disorientation last Tuesday when he'd forgotten where he was. The way his left hand sometimes felt numb for no reason. Alex stopped reading. Looked at his left hand. It did feel numb. Had felt numb occasionally for weeks, though he'd dismissed it as sleeping wrong or sitting in awkward positions. And the headaches. Yes, he'd been having headaches, more frequent lately, but he'd attributed them to stress, to long hours in the library, to staring at screens too long. The book continued. These weren't stress symptoms. They were neurological. A tumor growing slowly in the right frontal lobe of his brain. Had been there for approximately 8 months. Undetected. Asymptomatic, except for these small warning signs that Alex had ignored because he was 22 years old and invincible. The way all 22-year-olds are invincible until they're not. No. Alex shook his head. This was fear-mongering. Manipulation, someone trying to scare him. But his hand was numb. And the headaches were real. And that moment on Tuesday when he'd walked into his apartment and for 3 seconds hadn't recognized the space. That had happened. He'd dismissed it, laughed it off. But it had happened. Alex would want to dismiss this as fear-mongering, would tell himself the book was manipulating him. But deep down, in the part of himself that knew truth from fiction, he'd recognize that this explained everything. The fatigue, the occasional visual distortions, the increasing difficulty concentrating. All symptoms he'd been experiencing, but refusing to connect. Alex's breathing was coming faster now, shallower. He felt like the library walls were closing in. He would panic, would feel the walls closing in, would want to run to the hospital immediately, demand an MRI, prove the book wrong. But it was 9:04 p.m. now. Too late for walk-in appointments. He'd have to wait until morning. Would have to spend the night knowing, or thinking he knew, that something was growing in his brain. Alex checked his phone again. 9:04 p.m. The book had predicted his time-checking compulsion, was predicting his every thought and impulse. He forced himself to keep reading because the book was right. Not knowing was worse than knowing. The tumor was operable. That was the good news Alex would learn after the MRI in 3 days. Dr. Patricia Huang would explain it carefully, but that 17% would haunt him, because Alex Morrison, who'd spent 3 years studying free will and determinism, would suddenly face the ultimate question. If this book had predicted everything else in his life, had it also predicted whether he'd be in the 83% or the 17%? Was his survival already determined? Was the outcome of the surgery a foregone conclusion already documented somewhere in the remaining pages? Alex flipped ahead frantically, but the pages after chapter 50 were blank. White pages, empty, as though the story ended here, or as though the future beyond this moment hadn't been written yet. Or worse, as though there was no future beyond this moment to document. No, Alex whispered aloud. No, this is insane. This isn't real. But his hand was still numb. The headaches were still real. And the book had known things no one could know. Childhood memories, his parents' first meeting, his exact thoughts in real time. Alex pulled out his phone with shaking hands, called his roommate, Josh. Alex, what's up? I need you to do something for me, right now. Google brain tumor symptoms. What? Why? Are you okay? Just do it, please. A pause. Then Josh's voice, reading from a website. Persistent headaches. Numbness in extremities. Brief episodes of disorientation or memory loss. Visual disturbances. Difficulty concentrating. Alex, why am I reading this? Do I have those symptoms? I mean, you've mentioned headaches, and you've seemed kind of spacey lately. But that's just stress, right? Thesis pressure? Yeah, probably. Alex's voice sounded hollow, even to himself. He hung up before Josh could ask more questions. The book was still on the desk, open to chapter 50. Alex picked it up again, hands trembling so badly he almost dropped it. Alex would call his roommate, would hear the symptoms confirmed, would feel the reality of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket, and then he'd make a choice. The first real choice he'd made since finding the book. He could go to the hospital tonight, demand to be seen, tell them about the symptoms, force the diagnosis to happen now, rather than waiting 3 days as the book had predicted. Or he could follow the book's narrative exactly as written. Wait 3 days, get the MRI, hear Dr. Huang's diagnosis, maintain the timeline precisely. And this was the question that would torment him. Did the choice matter? If the book had predicted his tumor, had predicted his symptoms, had predicted this very moment, did it matter when he sought diagnosis? Was the tumor there? Was the surgery's outcome already determined? Would trying to deviate from the book's timeline change anything? Or was he always meant to make this choice? And the book had simply documented what was always going to happen. Alex slammed the book shut, shoved it away across the desk. He couldn't breathe. The third floor felt suffocating. He grabbed his laptop and bag, left the book on the desk, and practically ran to the stairs. Outside, the November air was cold and sharp, shocking his lungs. Alex walked across campus, not going anywhere in particular, just moving because staying still felt like suffocating. His phone rang. His mother. "Alex, honey, I was just thinking about you. How's the thesis going?" Alex almost laughed. His thesis on free will and determinism. The universe had a sense of humor. "It's going. Mom, can I ask you something? About when you met Dad?" "Of course. What about it?" "The Nietzsche quote." Alex picked up the book and flipped back to chapter 50, found the section he'd stopped at. Alex would panic and leave, would call his mother to verify a memory, to ground himself in the reality of his past, would return to the library because he needed to know how the chapter ended. Needed to know if the blank pages after chapter 50 meant what he feared they meant. Alex turned to those blank pages again, still empty. He flipped through them frantically. Dozens of pages, all blank, and then, near the end of the book, he found one more chapter, chapter 51. Just 3 paragraphs. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the book steady. Chapter 51. The choice he made. Alex Morrison had spent 3 years studying free will. He'd read Kant and Kierkegaard, Sartre and Schopenhauer. He'd written essays arguing that even in a deterministic universe, the subjective experience of choice was what mattered. His mother laughed. "Oh God, that. He was trying to impress me with some quote about looking into the abyss. But he mixed it up with something from Sartre. I corrected him and he was so embarrassed. Why? Just verifying a memory. You okay? You sound stressed." "I'm fine, just thesis pressure. I love you, Mom." "Love you too, honey." Alex hung up. The book had been right about that too. The Nietzsche quote. Everything. Which meant he turned around abruptly, walked back to the library, took the stairs to the 3rd floor. The book was still on the desk where he'd left it, as though it had been waiting for him. Because of course it had. The book probably documented this too. His moment of panic, his flee outside, his phone call to his mother, his return. All of it predicted, all of it predetermined. Now he faced the ultimate test of that philosophy. The book had predicted his past with perfect accuracy, had documented his present in real time, had revealed a future that was medical, specific, and terrifying. But the pages between chapter 50 and chapter 51 were blank. Not because the future didn't exist, but because it hadn't been written yet. Because Alex had to write it through the choices he made. The tumor was real. The symptoms were real. The need for medical intervention was real. But how he chose to face that reality, with defiance or despair, with courage or fear, with acceptance or rebellion. That was his. The book could predict the events of his life, but not the meaning he assigned to them, not the person he chose to be while facing them. Alex read the 3 paragraphs twice, 3 times. Then he closed the book and sat in silence for a long moment. The book had documented his life with eerie accuracy, had predicted his actions, his thoughts, his symptoms. But those final paragraphs felt different. Not like prediction, but like invitation. Like the book was offering him a choice about how to interpret everything that had come before. He could see this as proof of determinism, that his life was a fixed narrative, already written. His choices merely the execution of a script he'd been following without knowing it. Or he could see it as proof that even in a predetermined framework, there was freedom in how he responded, in who he chose to be. Alex pulled out his phone and scheduled an appointment with the University Health Center for tomorrow morning. Not in 3 days, as the book had predicted. Tomorrow, because whether or not the outcome was predetermined, he'd rather know sooner than later. Rather take action than wait passively for the timeline to unfold. He picked up the book one final time, considered taking it with him, but something made him return it to its hiding spot, behind the medieval philosophy texts. Someone else might find it, might need to read their own story, might need to face their own questions about choice and fate. As Alex walked out of the library, his left hand still numb, his head beginning to ache again, he thought about the blank pages between chapter 50 and chapter 51. The book had predicted his diagnosis, had warned him about the tumor, but it hadn't told him how the surgery would end, hadn't documented whether he'd be in the 83% or the 17%. Either that was because the future wasn't written yet, or it was because some outcomes were too important to spoil. Either way, Alex had to face it without knowing. The next morning, the doctor at the health center took his symptoms seriously enough to refer him immediately for an MRI. By that afternoon, Alex was in a hospital gown, being slid into a machine that would confirm or deny what the book had told him. The neurologist, Dr. Patricia Wong, just as the book had predicted, showed him the scans 2 hours later. "There's a mass in your right frontal lobe," she said gently. "About 2 centimeters. We'll need to do more tests, but it appears to be a low-grade glioma, treatable, operable." "What's the success rate?" Alex heard himself ask. "For this type of tumor, with surgery and follow-up treatment, we're looking at roughly 80 to 85% long-term survival. 83%, the exact number from the book. And the surgery itself carries risk, like any brain surgery. But you're young and healthy otherwise." "I'm optimistic," Alex nodded numbly. The book had been right about all of it. Over the next 2 weeks, as he prepared for surgery, Alex told his parents, told his friends, told his professors. He'd need to take a medical leave, finish his thesis later. Everyone was supportive, worried, hopeful. His mother cried. His father tried to hide his fear. Josh kept bringing over food and movies, trying to distract him. But Alex kept thinking about the book, about those blank pages, about whether his survival was already determined or still being written. The night before his surgery, Alex lay in his hospital bed, unable to sleep. He'd memorized the statistics. 83% survival rate, 17% chance of complications, stroke, infection, death. The numbers felt both clinical and deeply personal. He pulled out his phone and wrote in his notes app because he needed to document this moment himself, needed to write his own narrative. I don't know if I'm going to survive this surgery. The book didn't tell me, either because it couldn't or because it chose not to. Maybe that's the same thing. I've spent 3 years arguing that free will exists, even in a deterministic universe. That what matters isn't whether our choices are predetermined, but whether they align with our values, whether we act with authenticity. If that's true, then this is my authentic choice. I choose to hope. Not because I know I'll survive. I don't. But because hope is the stance I want to take towards uncertainty. The person I want to be. The book predicted my diagnosis, but I'm predicting my response. And my response is, I'm not gonna let fear define this moment. Whatever happens tomorrow, I faced it with courage, with love for the people who love me, with gratitude. That's my chapter. That's my contribution to the narrative. The book can predict events, but I get to choose my attitude toward them. And maybe that's what free will actually is. Alex saved the note, set his phone aside, closed his eyes. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. He woke at 6:30 to the sound of nurses preparing the OR. They came in with forms to sign, explanations of the procedure, reassurances that Dr. Huang was one of the best neurosurgeons in the state. Alex's parents were there, both trying to smile, both terrified. I love you, his mother said, squeezing his hand. Love you too, Mom. Both of you. I'll see you in a few hours. He tried to sound more confident than he felt. They wheeled him to the OR. The anesthesiologist explained what would happen, counting backward from 10, drifting off peacefully, waking up in recovery. Alex lay on the operating table, looking up at the bright lights, surrounded. Count backward from 10, the anesthesiologist said. 10, Alex said. 9, 8. He thought about the book, about the blank pages, about whether his next chapter was already written or still being composed. 7, 6. He thought about his thesis on free will, about Sartre's claim that we're condemned to be free, about Kierkegaard's leap of faith. 5, 4. He thought about his parents' meeting in that coffee shop, about the misremembered Nietzsche quote, about chain of causality that led to his existence. 3. He thought about the person he wanted to be, brave, hopeful, authentic. 2. And then darkness. Alex woke in recovery 6 hours later, groggy, disoriented, head wrapped in bandages. His mother's face swam into focus. Hey, honey, you made it. The surgery went well. Relief crashed over him so intensely he started crying. His mother cried too. His father appeared, squeezing his shoulder, unable to speak. Dr. Huang came in an hour later. We removed the tumor successfully. Minimal complications. You'll need follow-up treatment and monitoring. But I'm very pleased with how it went. I'm in the 83%, Alex said groggily. Dr. Huang smiled. You're in the 100% that survived surgery. That's all that matters right now. Over the next days and weeks, as Alex recovered, as he underwent radiation treatment, as his hair grew back and his strength returned, he thought often about the book, about those blank pages, about whether they'd been blank because the future was unwritten, or because some things needed to remain mysterious. And he never went back to the library to check if the book was still there. Part of him was afraid to look, afraid he'd find those blank pages, now filled in, documenting his surgery, his recovery, his future, proving that everything had been predetermined after all. But another part of him didn't want to know, preferred to live in the uncertainty, to believe that his choices mattered, that his attitude toward his illness had been genuinely his own, and not just another predicted response. 3 months after surgery, Alex returned to school, finished his thesis, graduated that spring with honors. His thesis was titled, Free Will in a Deterministic Universe, the Subjective Experience of Choice. In it, he wrote, even if every event is causally determined, even if we could theoretically predict all future actions with perfect information, the subjective experience of choosing, of deliberating, of weighing options, of acting according to our values, remains meaningful. We are the agents through which causality acts. Our reasoning, our emotions, our values, these are the mechanisms by which the universe makes decisions. In that sense, we are genuinely free, not despite determinism, but because of it. He never mentioned the book in his thesis, never told anyone about finding his life documented in a paperback with a black cover. It was his secret, his private confrontation with the questions he'd been studying theoretically. Sometimes, late at night, Alex wondered what had happened to the book, whether it was still wedged behind those medieval philosophy texts, whether someone else had found it, whether there were other copies, other people whose lives, but mostly, he chose not to think about it. Chose to live forward, making choices, building a life, acting as though his decisions mattered, even if he couldn't prove they weren't predetermined. 5 years later, Alex was working at a tech company in Seattle, living with a woman named Sarah, whom he'd met at a friend's wedding. Just as the book had predicted, sometimes he wondered if everything from the wedding to their first kiss to their decision to move in together had been documented in those pages. If he was still following a script he couldn't see, but he'd learned to live with uncertainty, learned that you could simultaneously believe your choices might be predetermined, and still feel the weight and responsibility of making them. Learned that freedom wasn't about being unpredictable, but about being authentic. And anyway, the book had only documented up to the surgery. Everything after, his recovery, his graduation, his job, Sarah, their apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, none of that had been written. Or if it had been, Alex had chosen not to read it. That was his choice, his chapter, his contribution to a narrative that had been both predicted and chosen, determined and free, written and yet still being composed with every decision he made. The book had shown him his diagnosis, but Alex had decided how to face it. And that decision, that choice to hope, to fight, to live authentically, even in the face of uncertainty, that was his, undeniably his. Whether or not it had been predicted didn't matter. He'd written his own ending, and he was still writing it, one choice at a time. In the blank pages that stretched forward,